Thank you all for coming to the second session in our Disability History lecture series. This is a series that Professor Kant Wills, Professor Patrick de Vlieger and myself founded a couple of months, or almost a year ago. And the idea is to bring together scholars working on the topic of disability from an interdisciplinary perspective. So our intention is that the perspective itself contains both anthropological, historical, as well as educational elements. And I think that the first presenter in this series, Monica Baar, who came from the Netherlands, Groningen, and spoke about the history of the blind dog in a comparative perspective, that she used and combined all those three elements. And I'm pretty sure that our next speaker, Ylva Söderfeldt, will also, in a way, be doing that. But I think the emphasis will be a little bit more on the philosophical approach of disability than on the educational. But I'll let you that decide after the lecture of Ylva Söderfeldt. I met Ylva actually in August on a conference, and we were walking to the restaurant in order to have dinner, and then all of a sudden we realized that in a sense we were working on the same topic, and we were kind of intrigued about the same question, and that question had to do with the fact who was actually the most unhappiest. Was it the deaf or was it the blind? And Ylva, she discovered a lot of sources in the German and the English language, and I had found a lot of sources in the Dutch and the French context. And so she will not be talking about that issue. We will talk about that tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock at the other side of the street. So if you are interested, you are more than happy to show up and also to follow that lecture. But today she is going to present actually a philosophical dissertation which was on the deaf history movement in Germany, and she will do that from the perspective of Habermas. We tried to invite Habermas too today. He will be here tomorrow evening, but unfortunately he couldn't come. I'm not sure, I'm just kidding. So that's just a short introduction. Ylva is working at the University Hospital in Aachen, where she teaches the history of medicine and is responsible for one course in disability history. So I myself am really looking forward to hear more about your philosophical dissertation, and I hope that all of you are of the same spirit. So I give the floor to you, and maybe just before starting, thanks to the colleagues who come from the University of Ghent for attending this lecture. I really appreciate it, and I would like to emphasize the fact that I really also appreciate the efforts of Goedele de Klerk for bringing a sign translator to this lecture. I think that is one topic that we as organizers should think about for the near future, and we should try to realize a bit more, or to make sure that next presentations have a presenter and a sign translator. Okay, that's it for now. I give the floor to Ylva Söderfeldt. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. I'm very happy to be here today, to be invited to this lecture series. And as Peter said, I'm a historian of medicine. I didn't start out that way. I started as a historian of ideas, and then because I studied disability history, I sort of transformed into a historian of medicine. But I'm not going to be talking a lot about medicine today. Actually, I don't think I'm going to be talking about medicine at all. But I'm going to present anyway pretty much what was my PhD dissertation, which I defended at the Stuttgart University in 2011, and now it's been published as a book at Transcript. It's over there if you want to have a look at it. And what it's about is it's about the German deaf movement in the 19th and early 20th century. And what I wanted to present today is to put a strong emphasis on the one part of the theoretical interpretation, and that is, of course, the things that I've learned from Habermas when studying the deaf movement. But you have to be nice to me today because I'm not a great theorist, so as you're going to see, maybe it's disappointing to you, maybe you're relieved. It's not going to be a very theoretical lecture anyway, it's going to be a lot about the empirical results. So, but maybe you can help me out with the interpretation, so we'll see. And what I'm asking is that if Habermas' model of the public sphere can help us understand the deaf movement, or is it the deaf movement, or in the wider sense disability, that helps us understand the public sphere? So, like, feminists have added gender aspects to the concept of the public sphere, and others have looked at the public sphere of the working classes. My intention is to add another perspective, another other, if you like, and that is disability. So first I'm going to go through a rather lengthy introduction. I'll present some of the basic issues concerning deafness and deaf people, and then go on to the specific conditions that people who were deaf lived under in Germany in the 19th century. Because those are the conditions that allowed the deaf movement to appear and also determine the structure of the movement. So I'd like to begin with some central concepts because I'm not quite sure of the backgrounds of my audience. I just want to make clear what I'm talking about. So deafness, deaf people, sign language, deaf communities, deaf culture. What is it? I like to think of deafness that as an entity that, like ethnicity or gender, is a way to be a person, a cultural entity, but it does still have strong connections to biological traits, but it's not limited to biological traits. So you could say that about ethnicity or gender too. And when I talk about deafness today, I'm talking about profound and early hearing loss, which is profound enough and early enough so that the person will not use spoken language as their first language. And as you know, these people were in the 19th century and until the 1930s, 1950s, somewhat called deaf mutes. So I'm going to use the word deaf mutes at some points. I'm not going to use, I'm always putting it in quotation marks, but I don't want to be doing that all the time, so please just remember that I'm distancing myself from that term, even though I'm not doing the quotation marks all the time. So, many of you are probably also familiar with the distinction between cultural and biological deafness, deafness with a capital D and deafness with a small d. So the most important distinguishing factor is, of course, the use of sign language. And about sign language, I always try to say in my lectures, otherwise I'm going to be asked. So it is, if somebody didn't know, it's signed languages are natural, idiomatic languages. They have evolved and emerged just like spoken languages. They are not representations of spoken languages, but are independent languages. So that's what they are, and therefore, of course, they're not international. So If we look at concepts and categories that are in use in research about deaf communities, deaf culture, we see that there's not much agreement on what defines these terms, deaf community, deaf culture. Carol Tadden and Tom Humphreys distinguish between deaf communities and deaf culture in the way that deaf communities include people who sign and are deaf in a specific place and their hearing allies, whereas deaf culture is limited to signing deaf people, but is trans-regional and even international. Another way of looking at it comes from Paul Higgins, who uses deaf community as a way to distinguish a volitional, self-determined deafness, as opposed to deafness as a stigma. So one chooses to be deaf by entering a deaf club, which is the center of the community. However, I've tried to put those definitions aside a bit while working, because as a historian, I see that those concepts are not historical. They're used by contemporary sociologists and the like, and I've tried to let my analysis of the deaf movement be as free as possible of presuppositions about deaf people based on the contemporary situation. But when I view deaf people in their particular historical context here in Germany in the 19th century, it becomes clear that this was a time when a new kind of deaf person appeared. And this was to a great extent due to the emergence of organized deaf education. The first attempts at deaf education came about in the 16th century, but that was individual and private teaching. And from the 18th century, we have Abbé de Lepé in France and Samuel Heinecke in Germany, who founded schools. So then we have institutional deaf education. And that means that larger numbers of deaf children were brought together and brought up together in residential schools. So the result was that the pupils were connected to each other, that they built networks across generations through deaf teachers, and they shared the experience of school. They shared growing up together. They acquired the same level of education. They often learned similar trades, so that the result was a group of people who had a lot more in common than just being deaf. I found it helpful then in my research to distinguish between network and community for those people. So networks in this case are the personal connections between pupils, but also connections to certain, maybe very important hearing persons, if you like. For instance, teachers and preachers, trade masters, family members, etc. Community, to me, is something bigger. It's the idea of being part of something greater. So in Benedict Anderson's words about the imagined community, community is the idea, the thought of thousands and thousands like yourself. So in Germany, in France, in the US, etc., there are other deaf schools. They are teaching other deaf children in a similar manner. And I, then, as a deaf person in Germany, I don't know them personally, but we share something. I have the idea that we share something. And we are sort of similar then to a nation, because also in a nation you won't know every single person in the nation, but you have the idea that you share something. So what did they share? We need to know something about the educational situation, of course, in the 1820s until about the early 1900s. And of course it's dominated by the methods debate, so between oral education and manual education. And even in Germany, before about 1850, the sign language was used in most schools. So then there was, about 1850, this started to change and sign language was pushed out from schools. This movement was, oralist movement was connected to ideas from eugenics and nationalism, and the plan was to break up the deaf communities and to assimilate and normalize deaf people. But at the same time, at the exactly same time, so the latter half of the 19th century, there was a considerable expansion of the deaf education system. So the educated deaf were no longer an exclusive small group. This entailed also that the class structure of educated deaf people changed. There were teaching was no longer available as a profession for deaf people, but also there were structural changes in the economy that made crafts less lucrative, so that we can speak of a certain level of proletarianization of deaf people. However, this is something that is hard to be really sure about, because the reason why I say that is that we need to specify which people we're talking about when we're saying that the deaf people are being proletarianized. So who were the deaf mutes? Who did people mean in the 19th century when they used that term? I soon realized that this word deaf mute did not mean the same kind of people all of the time. So rather, the deaf mutes were constructed and characterized in very different ways in different contexts. One important context is statistics. So I have a picture for you of statistics. They were made in Germany from about 1800, the year 1800, and different methods were used during the 19th century. They listed in lists like this one various characteristics of deaf people, so like sex, age, confession, place of residence, occupation, position in the household, onset and cause of deafness, etc., etc. The purpose of these studies were at first, educational and social, just counting how many deaf mutes do we have to plan the education that we need to provide. But later, medical and eugenic purposes were added to this. So a quote from one of these statistic works is, "It must be the aim of the statistics to, on one hand, determine the prevalence of the defects, on the other, to discover their nature and causes, so that measures can be taken through which their incidence can be prevented as far as possible." So that's a medical motivation, of course, for statistics. And what can you see on a page like this when it looks like this? Well, I like to think of it that a person appears on this page, an average deaf mute. So it's not an individual, but it's the sum of many. And that's, of course, the nature of statistical knowledge as such. So the average deaf mute was not one person, but he appeared as one person in the statistics. You could say that he has this occupation, he lives in this kind of place, he is not married, for instance, that all the typical traits could be added together to describe an average deaf mute. And this adds up to a pretty bleak image. So the nature of statistics is, of course, that successes, remarkable people, are exceptions, and they just drown in these numbers. So they become insignificant. Instead, the main characteristic of the average deaf mute is that he was or she was a very dependent, low-status person. So they have no occupation or low-status occupations. They didn't have independent households, but lived with relatives, seldom married, and so forth. And the way that the society handled deaf people was determined by that image. And I'd like to refer here to a concept from Habermas, and that is strategic action. So the system, according to Habermas, acts by means of power and money, and not by communication. And for the deaf, that meant that such things as special education, continued control and supervision after graduation, which is, of course, exercises of power, and interaction through the means of money, which was done by charity and welfare, and also the so-called deaf-mute bonuses, which was a system where trade masters received a bonus from the state to train deaf apprentices. And this is the context that is, to me, so important for understanding the deaf movement and the argument that I will try to make. Because, as I said, the word deaf-mute had different meanings depending on when and where the term was used. And we already encountered the average deaf-mutes. But in the middle of the 19th century, there began to appear another kind of deaf-mute. So what happened is that the object, the deaf person, began to speak, so to say, about himself, to publicly define himself, and thereby a totally different image appeared. So now I finally arrive at the first deaf club in Germany. It was formed in May 1848 in Berlin, which is an interesting coincidence because it's, of course, in the middle of the revolution. And that is interesting on several levels. Of course, it is a club, and clubs and associations played a very important part in the revolution and also in the course of the 19th century, particularly for the bourgeoisie, when they tried to gain influence and rise to power. So what did you do? You formed a club. And that's what the deaf did too.
So in which year did the...
Which year? 1848.
48.
Yeah. Another thing that's interesting is, of course, that one of the main ideological aspects of this failed revolution was nationalism, the idea of uniting the Germans. Because Germany was, so to speak, a nation without a state. And there was the idea that we are Germans, we are split up in different small states, but we share something. What do we share? Language and culture, and we want to unite. So this is interesting when you read the statement that the club, the Deaf Club in Berlin released when they formed in 1848. Here. The male deaf-mutes in Berlin, living in Berlin, joined together in an association which shall carry the name Taubstummverein. The purpose, this is the second quote, the purpose is the ethical vitalization and further spiritual education of its members, the recreational gathering, and I've made this, I marked this passage, of the up until now solitarily living companions in suffering, to edify messages and conversations, support of the individual, and so forth and so forth. So what do we see in this quote? These people this small group of men present themselves as the deaf mutes. The deaf mutes have now joined together. So, the deaf mutes of Berlin, but still, the deaf mutes of Berlin have joined together. And up until now, they have been solitarily living, and now they join together. So they imagine themselves as a community, not because they were acquainted. They don't say, we pals here in this restaurant have joined together, not because they were acquainted, but because they were joined together across space by something else, by language and culture. What led up to this, I believe, so it appears, was a deaf network in Berlin in the 1840s, maybe 1830s, which consisted of former pupils of the Royal Asylum in Berlin, who would socialize in a kind of salons. They would meet in private homes, they would visit each other, and they were a mix of three professionals, like artists and craftspeople, but there was a very, very big social span of these people. So they were really poor people and also noble people, and they were all a circle of friends and would meet in each other's home and socialize. So this is a bracketing of social class, which is enabled by the shared deaf experience. Later, public places such as cafes and taverns became main meeting places. So the narratives in the deaf press say that the first club emerged from a group of regulars in a Berlin tavern, and later guest houses were the usual places for meetings and club activities. And I, of course, need to show you this very beautiful picture here, which is from a illustrated magazine from Austria. And I think it explains itself, right? It's a coffee house of the deaf mutes, is the name of the picture. So from about the 1860s, more clubs formed across Germany. And from the 1870s, we have newspapers, deaf press, that reported on the activities of the movement and things of interest for deaf people. So this means that the community grew beyond the local network and connected individual deaf people with thousands and thousands, like himself. I'll just have a look at the time, okay. I think I'll skip a little bit just to be able to keep in time. I had a couple of more quotes, but I'll skip a bit. Anyway, what we see, the press, the clubs, the cafes, is that the the ways that deaf people connected to each other were the same channels that we associate with the bourgeois public sphere. So it's the salons, it's the cafes, it's the press, it's the club, and so forth. Then the next question will be, what was the character of these people who organized? Who were the organized deaf? So again, we're still working on the question, who were the deaf mutes here? I'm still at that point. And I've looked at where these people describe themselves, and they do that not in statistics, of course, but in small biographical accounts of deaf persons that originate from deaf authors. So there are a couple of such collections as books, the earliest from 1832. And then from the 1870s in the press there are lots of these texts, of course mainly obituaries, but also congratulations to birthdays, anniversaries, and so forth. And altogether I think I have about 100 texts or so. And the nature of such text is of course that they emphasize the extraordinary, not like in statistics where the extraordinary disappears. That's the complete opposite. So the especially successful and talented, of course, receive attention. When you look at these biographies, they offer a fairly consistent set of characteristics that crucially differed from those that were set up for the deaf mutes in the official professional hearing world accounts. So typical for these people that you can see depicted here, pretty much, were petty bourgeoisie vocations, mostly crafts, or maybe they were skilled workers, but still. They emphasized virtues such as independence, diligence, loyalty, again, bourgeois virtues. What didn't appear were people from the countryside, farm work, poor people, socially disadvantaged people who were dependent on their family and so forth. No, that this was not a description of the average deaf mute as we know him. It was a description of successful, cultivated, urban, skilled workers or craftsmen. Men, that is very important. They were almost exclusively men. So what we see is pretty much then in the 19th century two discursive constructions under the designation deaf mute. Both were based on real individuals, but depending on the type of source, the type of text and the author, they were completely different. They were even contradictory to each other. And this opposition is crucial because eventually these two constructions clashed with each other. Because the organized deaf had this self-image, I mean they were individuals, but they also had the self-image that they were at least quasi-bürger or bourgeoisie. They had the usual preconditions for entering the public sphere, that is Besitz und Bildung, property and education, so they had that. They, of course, felt entitled to participating in the public sphere and to be acknowledged on basis of their arguments, of course, because that's the way the public sphere works. You are not valued because of who you are valued because of what you say. So that's what they felt entitled to, because they fulfilled the preconditions. Yeah, so they began trying to make themselves heard on issues concerning deaf people, foremost, of course, the right to sign language, and they used the press, they used their congresses, they used different kinds of lobbyings. And I think instead of describing what happened, I'll just start with a quote which will make it clear to you. So this is Edward Walter. He was the most famous educator of deaf people in Germany in the late 19th century. So he is commenting here, and you need to know the context in order to understand the quote. He is commenting on a new periodical for deaf people which has been issued, and he's commenting in the paper for teachers of the deaf. So he says, "Oh, the writing deaf mutes. As much as we are inclined to feel joy about some of our former students being brought so far that they are able to clearly and comprehensively express their thoughts, we also know that those who consider themselves to have reached a somewhat higher level of cultivation than their comrades in fate are unpleasantly presumptuous and act with the pretensions of great men." So this is the clash. There is no communicative action between the teacher and the deaf. He doesn't reply to the arguments that the deaf people are offering. He dismisses them as unqualified because of who they are. So this is what was always repeated in this kind of situations when the deaf tried to make a statement. There was only interaction by means of power and money. So the deaf people didn't have any influence over the school. The schools were in the hands of hearing people who used their power to dismiss the demands of the deaf. Or in other instances is, for instance, the church feast in Berlin, which was an important event where deaf people from all over Germany would gather once a year to meet. And the teachers realized that there was a lot of socializing and signing going on, of course, between deaf people, so they put a stop to it by cancelling the railroad discounts that had made this possible. So that's an example of system interaction by the means of money, of course. So why did this happen? How can Habermas help us understand this? I've touched rather superficially, of course, on Habermas as a way of describing this, but it doesn't suffice, I think, to say that the deaf were turned down because they didn't hear. It has to be something else. And it puzzled me. And it probably, at least subconsciously, really puzzled the deaf elite, because they did fulfill these criteria of property and education. They were perhaps not ideal typical Bürger or bourgeoisie. They were admittedly also not living at the supposed height of the public sphere, but still, some of them had really prestigious positions. There was a factory owner named John Pacha. There was the civil servant in the Prussian administration called Edward Fürstenberg, but that didn't help. They weren't listened to anyway. So why? I wondered about this for a while until I realized, at least my theory is, that the key is not in the model of the public sphere itself, but the key is in the way that it, according to Habermas, declined. The way that it declined is that the preconditions that you need to know in order to understand my argument, I should say, is that the people in the public sphere have a double character. They are hommes and bourgeois. They live in the private sphere and the public sphere, and they live there as, on the one hand, property owners, and on the other hand, as humans, pure and simple. And the bourgeois private home, the family, is really the nucleus of their existence. And that it is private is very important. So from this private space, they are able to enter the public sphere, to emerge as private people into the public sphere. Here it is the way that Habermas put it. It's it rests upon the fictitious identity of private people come together as the public in their double roles as property owners and as humans, pure and simple. But during the 19th and 20th centuries, Habermas notices what he calls a refeudalization, which means that those two spheres are no longer clear-cut, the private and the public. The public enters and meddles with the private sphere, and the family is no longer the sole protection of the individual. The individual relies on the public to cover his needs as a private person. Here is a quote. So for along with its functions in capital formation, the family increasingly lost also the functions of upbringing and education, protection, care and guidance, indeed on the transmission of elementary tradition and frameworks of orientation. In general, it lost its power to shape conduct in areas considered the innermost provinces of privacy by the bourgeois family. And one night, when I was very alone and miserable in a hotel room and only had Habermas as my company, I realized that this process began earlier for deaf people, right? So if you think about it, they were already from the late 18th century not raised in the family, but they were raised in public institutions. And surrounding them, there were several publicly controlled support systems. So this was, of course, for most of them, that's what's so ironic about it, the only way to obtain property and education. And it was also a precondition for the formation of a deaf community. But at the same time, it robbed them of their private sphere. They became what you could call public persons. But they weren't public persons in the sense of a king, a monarch from earlier times. Habermas talks about that. They were public persons in another sense because of the way society handled their disability. They became public boards. So they were the responsibility of the public. And combined with the statistically based image, where exceptions didn't matter, this applied to everyone. So even if they did have a family, for instance, they remained in the eyes of those in power objects of public intervention. So that is the explanation I can offer for their inability to enter the public sphere, because they didn't have a private sphere that they could emerge from. And this was a very frustrating situation, and forced people in the deaf movement to invent strategies by which they hoped to be able to reach a position where they would be listened to. It seems that they were aware that they suffered from being associated with the average deaf-mute, so they began to try to distance themselves from that person, which in turn meant a lack of communicative action within the deaf movement itself. So based on the interest of the deaf elite, certain other deaf people became victims of strategic action modeled on the interaction that took place between the deaf as a group and the system. These strategies can be divided in different categories. So we had silence, as mentioned. There was hardly any trace in the deaf press of the indigent, rural, dependent deaf-mutes that the government found when performing surveys. These people existed, of course, but you can't see them in the deaf press. They don't exist. These kinds of people were not relevant to the construction of a self-image of the deaf community. Deaf women, inmates of institutions, rural deaf people, those who were impoverished, dependent on others, they were almost completely ignored, just like deaf people in general as a group were ignored in hearing society. Then there was also concern in the deaf movement that people who, for instance, begged or peddled or committed crimes would hurt the reputation of all deaf people. Of course, that's a sort of image problem would appear. And such behavior, of course, certainly conflicts with an image of the deaf as well-established, educated bourgeoisie or respectable workers. So they tried to discipline them, to campaign against them, or to distance themselves from those people. One moment where this contrast appeared that is perhaps most drastic was at the 1896 Congress, where one participant...
18 what?
96.
Yeah, go on.
One participant complained about deaf peddlers and said they do not even leave one be with the family in the evening. And I think this is great because in this brief quote, he positions himself in a stereotypical image of bourgeois family seclusion, and this scenery is disturbed by the deaf peddler, of course literally, but also symbolically, right? So he needed to distance himself from the deaf peddler in order to keep his identity. And this disciplining resembles, of course, how the educational system would exercise power over deaf people. But the perhaps most powerful strategy that they used, I think, was to position themselves, the deaf elite, to position the deaf elite as a benefactor towards others more unfortunate deaf. Because if you are a giver of support, you are independent, you are so well off and competent that you can help others. And according to the hearing worldview, the deaf people were receivers of help. But if they appeared as givers, as philanthropists, they couldn't be receivers. So there were a lot of calls to support other deaf. It could be by money or by advocacy, and the other deaf could be, for instance, the uneducated, the elderly, the multiply disabled, those who were unable to work, those who were less talented and cultivated than the deaf elite, purportedly. And the deaf elite used the same means that the hearing used to support and control the deaf. So the deaf movement built institutions for deaf people. It distributed financial contributions and so forth. And this was a very common type of activity in deaf clubs, so that compared to the informal deaf network, compared to the salons in the early 19th century, where there was a public sphere in a classical sense, a bracketing of social barriers and communicative interaction across those lines between free individuals. The deaf movement represented a bureaucratization and a systematization of that solidarity and emphasized, instead of bracketing, social difference. An example of that, which I've selected as a counterpart to Albert Walter, is a quote by the deaf teacher and deaf leader August Schenk, who was Walter's main antagonist in this debate. And it's a text where he comments on Walter's views. Since I just want to say something before, since I've included this quote in my dissertation, I've learned from other people that they understand it in a completely different way than I do. So it would be interesting to hear your impression of it. But let's just read it first. So, if we look at our parroting, faintly talented companions in suffering, we are soon convinced that eternal spiritual night would surround those unfortunates if they would not enter the deaf-mute club and there learn the indispensable sign language and there acquire the necessary knowledge. For with his small vocabulary, he cannot extract spiritual nourishment from books and papers. And then the modern speech fanatics want to deny any value of sign language and, what's more, give it the blow of death. So, what I make of this quote is that it's clearly not August Schenk himself who needs sign language. He is not the person who can't benefit from reading, of course. He not only read, he wrote, he contributed to the media that those unfortunates couldn't access. So he wasn't in need of sign language in order to avoid the eternal spiritual night, but he used the idea that some other deaf people were to add gravity to his demand for its use. And of course the reason that he had to do this is that being able to speak and lip read, being similar to the hearing, was high status. So he was unable to demand the right to sign language for himself, but he could evoke the image of the parroting, faintly talented companion in suffering and demand sign on his behalf. So he made himself a benefactor and raised his status. But what he didn't do is to put this person whom he talks about on the stage and let him, work for his own interest. That was these people didn't exist in the public sphere of the deaf movement. They weren't represented.
What was the last idea? Can you just repeat?
What August Schenk didn't do is to let that person appear and speak, so to say, for himself. So August Schenk interprets what his interests are and speaks for him. And I'm going now to reach my conclusion, that the relationship between the deaf and the public sphere was self-contradictory. Through, above all, institutionalized education, deaf people in the 19th century were able to reach a position where they had property and education. But the very means that brought them there simultaneously deprived them of their private sphere. And there was no way of escaping this. The strategies that they used only led to divisions. So what does this do for the understanding of Habermas? I think in a sense it's just another other. It once again breaks up the narrative and shows on the one hand the power of Habermas' model, but on the other hand also the limitations, how it must be adjusted in the individual case. But above all, I think that the exclusion of people because of disability and hence lack of privacy has a particular dynamic that must be distinguished from other kinds of exclusion. So, for instance, women were excluded from the public sphere because they were confined in the private sphere.